All right, welcome to week 5 of Digging Deeper. We're on Mark 7 and 8 this week. Happy 4th of July week to everyone. Hope you're having a good summer as we are going to hit the halfway point of Mark this week. And I wish we could cover everything, but we can't. We don't have time. We're just going to look at one part again today because I think it's so important and it would actually be easy to overlook it. I'm going to explain that in a second. But before we do, we're not going to cover chapter 8 in this devotional today, which is too bad because it is a pivotal chapter in the book. It is the halfway point. So before we jump into what we want to dig deeper on today, I just want to tell you this, to look at this in chapter 8, the first half of Mark is going to end, and Jesus is going to really claim two very important things. The first is this, that he is the king of all things. He is God. Yet he is going to take up his cross. He's going to start to emphasize that in chapter 8. He is unlike any other king because he came to take up his cross. And that confuses people. And the disciples even are like, no. I don't know about that. Okay, the second thing he claims is that in order to follow him as king, in order to be his disciple, you have to take up your cross also. That fullness of life is found in laying down your personal interest in taking on a relationship with Jesus. So just look for that. That's really important. That's in chapter 8. We'll talk about that more as we keep going. But what we're going to talk about today is this. This is in Mark 7. It's in verses 1 through 23. We're not going to read all the verses. I'm just going to kind of talk about the story. And the reason why is this, because we're going to be talking about some stuff that it would be easy to read it and kind of go, yeah, I don't know what that means. I'm just going to move on to other stuff. I want to talk about it because it's so important. And it actually had a huge effect on my own life a few years ago when I really looked at it, okay? So before we do, I want to tell you the story. A few weeks ago, I was brushing my teeth. I don't know if you've ever had this happen. And I felt something drop, and next thing I know, there was toothpaste all over my shirt. So I apparently, years into brushing my teeth, still spilled the toothpaste. So toothpaste all over the shirt, and it was a shirt that I really liked. And I went online. I was like, how do you get toothpaste out of a shirt? So I'm kind of cleaning it, and I want the easy route. So I'm cleaning it, kind of doing some water, wipe it down. I'm like, sure, it'll go out. And it dries, and I look, and the stain is still there. There's still this toothpaste stain. I'm like, man, I'm going to lose this shirt. And I was trying things. I just couldn't figure it out. Well, what it really took is it needed to actually go into the washing machine. Okay, nothing that I could do was going to clean it. It needed to go into the washing machine. And sure enough, when it came out, thankfully, it was clean of the stain. Okay, now here's why I tell you that is because I don't know if you've ever had that happen. You're like, oh my gosh, I just stained something that I love. And you got to deep clean it. And sometimes our attempts at cleaning something, it's not in the end going to work. Now I tell you that because that is basically the idea Jesus is going to get at today in this story. Is he's saying, hey, we all have this stain, if you will. And a lot of the ways that we try to get the stain out is not going to work. That there's only one thing that's going to get the stain out. If you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, let me show you what I'm talking about. In Mark 7, Jesus is having another conflict with the religious leaders. They're kind of going at it again. And this time it's over the cleanliness laws. So if you don't know what that is, in the Old Testament, there are all these laws about cleanliness. These are ritual laws. Now you read this, and if you read verses 1 through 5 in Mark 7, you'll be like, I don't even know what that has to do with me. Like, that's great. That's Old Testament. That's Israel. Don't see what it has to do with me. But actually, I'm going to show us it has a ton to do with us today. So if you're like, what are the cleanliness laws? This is what I'm talking about is that here's some examples. If you touch a human or animal that's dead, you are unclean. That's one of the laws. If you have an infectious skin disease, you are unclean. If you touch and come into contact with mildew, that would make you unclean. If you eat an unclean meat, so certain meats were considered unclean, that would make you unclean. If you're like, what's the consequence? The consequence of that is that you would not be able to go into the temple, meaning that you would not be able to worship God with the community of believers. And that's a problem. You were not able to get into God's presence to worship him. Now, why would they be there? Well, because the point is this, is that they are pointing people outside of themselves to see God is clean. He is completely holy, and I'm not. So in order to be in his presence, some type of cleaning has to take place. So those laws were in place to point them to that reality, Okay, now why don't we have to follow those ritual laws of cleanliness today as Christians? Well, we're going to talk about that in a second. That's actually what the story is largely about. So I want to pick it up in verses 14 because Jesus disagrees with them. They're like, man, your disciples aren't following all of these rules about cleanliness. What's going on? Okay, now this is what Jesus says. This is verse 14. He says, he called the people to him again and he said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. Okay, this is what Jesus is saying, is that the real problem that we have is not outside of us. The real problem, the biggest problem that all of us have is actually inside of us. It's our own hearts. I'm going to flesh that out in a second, but the reality is this is what he's saying. Our problem is not, man, we just need to follow a bunch of rules and try to be a good person. No, our problem is that deep inside of us, we are sinners. We have hearts that are sinful. Now, we live in a world that rejects that idea. The world we live in rejects largely the idea of sin, the idea of judgment, the idea that God is holy. We don't want to talk about that stuff in our world today. Yet, at the exact same time, so many people feel deep down like there's something wrong with them. Like they need to fix themselves somehow. That's why we spend as a country so much money on clothes, so much money on looking good, so much money on trying to make ourselves look good to other people. Because we know there's this thing, it's like deep down, I'm not as I should be. So I've got to do stuff to make myself look good so I can get people's approval. So our society, we reject sin, yet we feel like something's wrong with us. And because we reject sin, we're not going to find the solution unless we understand what Jesus is saying. Now, he fleshes this out even more. This is verse 20. He goes on. We're going to skip ahead and then come back. He said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and they defile a person. Okay, so this is what Jesus is saying, is that what's really the problem in the world today? The problem, according to Jesus, is the self-centeredness of the human heart that leads to all sorts of bad actions. So when we see these actions that he listed, all these things that he talks about, the things that we see on the news, the things that we see in our society, some of the things that you even experience maybe in your own life or at school, he says they all come from one thing, the self-centeredness of the human heart, that is the real problem. That's what's really wrong with us. That's what Jesus is saying. So here's why this is important, is because the world we live in says, no. It's actually not the problem. Okay? What you really need to do is you need to go and look to things outside of you to make you happy and to try to fix this feeling that something is wrong. Okay, so here's some examples of how we do that in our world today. All right, number one is this, religion. And when I say religion, this is what I mean. I mean that we try to be a really good person, follow all the rules, go to church, do all these things to check off the list so that God will be happy with us or so that other people will see us as the good Christian person. Okay, now here's the thing with religion is you can follow all the rules on the outside. You can know all the Bible answers. You can check all the boxes, but not have a heart that is filled with love and joy because you have a relationship with God. So that doesn't ultimately solve the problem. It's kind of like having a carton of spoiled milk. And it's a beautiful carton. The carton looks amazing. It's decorated. But inside the carton is spoiled milk. That's what religion does to us. Is we follow all the rules. We look good on the outside. But on the inside, we're not filled with love and joy. It's spoiled milk in a carton that looks good. So Jesus is like, hey, that's not going to solve the problem. Okay, we also might look to politics. I was reading this New York Times article last week, and what the guy was basically saying is, hey, there's all these struggles in our country right now, and he listed a few of them, and I agreed with him. I was like, absolutely. But then at the end, his point was, hey, the solution is politics. We need to solve government problems, and then, he was proposing how to do that. And the issue is this, is that human history proves that just getting certain people in office or getting certain policies enacted, ultimately it's not going to solve the problem of the human heart that Jesus is talking about, because in any system, a human heart is going to express itself. It doesn't matter what the system is, doesn't matter who's in office, human hearts are going to find a way to continue to be sinful. And that's what Jesus is really ultimately saying here. So politics aren't going to get it done, and human history proves that. Okay, here's another one. You're like, well, those two things aren't really my thing. Another one is this. It can be fame. It can be success. It can be worldly success and accomplishments. If you think about this, there are so many stories of celebrities who they get everything they want. They're finally successful. They get everything they want. They reach their dreams, and they're actually even less happy than they were before. There's so many stories of this. Jim Carrey, he said, man, I wish everybody could be rich and famous to see that it will not satisfy you. Tom Brady, after winning a bunch of championships, he says, I feel like something else is still out there. Madonna, one of the most famous singers of all time, she had similar comments. There's a woman who spent a lot of time with celebrities. She would write articles about them, and she said, man, if you could see them behind the scenes, you would see people who have achieved everything they want and they're not happy. They're not satisfied. And the reality is true for us today. We might become as successful as we want to in the world's eyes, but it doesn't fix what's in here. It's kind of like what I was saying at the beginning about the stain in the shirt. Is we try to kind of wipe it up, but it doesn't ultimately get the stain out. Okay, the last one is this. It can actually be ministry. This is for me, because this is what happened to me a few years ago, is a lot of people can go into being pastors and ministers and missionaries, not because they love God, but because they want God to be approving of them, because they're doing all this ministry stuff. Or they can go, I want people to applaud for me because I'm leading a good Bible study or teaching well, that kind of thing. And that doesn't work either. And I was struggling with that a few years ago. And I ultimately read this story and it really hit me. I was really leaning on what people were saying about me in ministry to make me feel good about myself. And when I read this story, it really changed everything. Now, why? Because Jesus actually tells us what the solution is. The thing that will actually get the stain out of the shirt. And this is what he says. It's actually in verse 19. And it's kind of random. You're like, wait, this is the solution? It's in parentheses. If you look at your Bible, he's talking about this idea that we've just talked about. And he says this. Mark says this. Thus he declared all foods clean. Now this is weird. Because what Mark is doing is he's adding a comment in there. He never does this. So this is really important. Because he's saying, hey, this is what Jesus meant. By saying what he's saying, he declared all foods clean. What does that mean? Well, remember at the beginning when I said as Christians, we don't follow those laws about cleanliness that I was talking about at the beginning? Why not? It's because of this verse. Because Jesus came to fulfill the law. All the laws in the Old Testament, Jesus came to fulfill perfectly. He came to obey all of them. Where we disobeyed, Jesus came to obey perfectly. Now, how did he fulfill this? Because 2 Corinthians 5:21 says that God made him who knew no sin, that's Jesus, to become sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. What does that have to do with cleanliness? Because on the cross, think about this, Jesus became dirty. He was spit upon. His body was ripped apart. He was bleeding. And he took on the filthiness, the penalty that we deserve for our sin, our self-centered hearts. It was all poured on him on the cross so that we could be named righteous. We could be clothed with his righteousness, that he takes away all of our dirtiness. He gets the stain out and he covers us with clean garments, with clean clothes, his own righteousness. That's the gospel. And that's what this story is about. That Jesus is saying, I came to be clean for you. So if you're here today and you're feeling guilty and you don't even know where it comes from, or maybe you really have something you feel guilty about, Jesus is saying you trying to cover it up or you just trying to be good is not going to get the stain out. You've got to turn to him and the cross. That's the only thing that's going to heal you and forgive your guilt and allow you to live in freedom. If you're here and you're trying to cover it, this feeling, and make yourself feel better about yourself by proving yourself to other people, by being really good at something, by being awesome, by doing a bunch of things to try to feel good, Jesus is saying that's not going to work. That's not going to work either. Tim Keller, when he writes about this chapter in his book on Mark, he says, quotes the hymn, and he says, cast your deadly doing down at Jesus' feet. Stand in him alone, gloriously complete. Turn to him today, rest in him. He alone can deal with the problem in our hearts and fill us with the love that we're looking for. All right? Hope that encourages you. We'll see you again next week.